Hello, welcome to Unit 4, Part D. This is the last part for this Unit 4. And to remind you to take the quiz for quiz number 4D when you're done watching that. And please make sure you've taken all 4 quizzes for this unit. The sooner you get that done, the better, while it's still fresh in your brain. This unit part, we're going to talk about mining and fishing as the two main topics. And so let's get started and talk about mining. The definition: it's the removal of mineral resources from the ground. After mining, ore is removed from gangue during processing. So if you can imagine, some mines are just a big open pit where earth and minerals have been removed from the ground. But whatever the target ore is that they're looking for, if it's copper ore or iron ore, there's usually a lot of dirt that surrounds the ore, and that's called the gangue. And when it's processing, during the processing, if it's something that's from the ore, it has to be separated from the gangue. And then if it's a metal ore, then some kind of additional processing has to occur to separate the mineral from the ore compound. So here are some types of non-renewable mineral resources, and one thing about mining is that pretty much anything that is mined is not renewable. And so examples of metallic ores like iron, copper, and aluminum. Non-metallic mining products could be salt, gypsum, clay, and sand. And also energy resources such as coal, natural gas, and note the radioactive isotopes that are used for nuclear power. And just to take a moment to point out that nuclear power does have a lot of environmental benefits, but it is still not a renewable resource. That there's only a certain amount of radioactive fuel on the planet, and there will never be more than what there is now. It would always be less. So if you look carefully at this diagram here, just to explain some of the vocabulary words. And an identified resource is one where you know the location, quality, and quantity, and whether or not it's practical to remove them. If you know where they are, it's just considered an identified resource. Undiscovered is the opposite, and they're generally things that we might infer are present based on the geology of the surroundings. So undiscovered are not ones that are actually seen, just maybe thought to be somewhere. Something is called a reserve if you know the location of it, you know where it is, and not only that, it has to be economically feasible, meaning profitable, to remove that resource from the earth. So there are certain even oil deposits that are not practical to attain yet because it might be more expensive to extract it based on how much money it's worth. And then as time goes on, as resources get depleted, what used to be not economical to mine might now be economical because the prices have risen. So shown on this graph, undiscovered is just stuff we don't know there, but just because we know where something is, it's considered identified, but doesn't necessarily mean it's a reserve. A reserve is only something that's known and economically feasible to take from the earth. Here is a type of mining called open pit. In this photograph on the right, you can see in the bottom of this pit are dump trucks. So this is a pretty big pit. You can see they have a road built so that they can just drive the trucks down into there. And these, the trucks they use in mining, these tires are bigger than a grown man standing up. So these vehicles are pretty enormous that they use. So the open pit is surface mining, and it's obviously very disruptive to the environment, moving a whole bunch of dirt out of a hole, and it's going to lead to things such as erosion and maybe exposing that community to pollutants used in the mining process. And don't underestimate the amount of fossil fuels that are being burned to extract this stuff from the earth here. All those trucks burn gasoline, and they're contributing to the burning of fossil fuels. Another type of extraction is called dredging, and this is done in the water, and you can see there's a specially equipped vehicle here that's meant to pick up resources from the bottom of a body of water and has a little backhoe to move them little bucket there to move them to on land. But dredging is the taking of underwater deposits. Another type of extraction is the area strip mine. This is also surface mining, but they can do this in a flat landscape, and they're just removing a whole bunch of the earth here to try to separate ore from it. But it's a mine that is taken from the surface, just as the previous two were, the open pit and the dredging. And you're not going underground after these resources. Here's something called a contour strip mining. In the cartoon here, you can see here's a mining piece of a mining equipment and maybe a truck that they're loading. Oops. And in this case, it looks like coal is what's being mined. And the land, you can see that there's a pretty good part of the mountain over top of the coal, and this is called the overburden. This is different than the gang that we talked about before. The overburden does not contain any resource, but it's sitting on top of your resource, and you pretty much have to dig your resource out from underneath of it. So this contour strip mining, they know that the coal is buried underneath the mountain, and the way that they choose to extract it is to remove a lot of the earth above it, but to do so in steps so that the mountain doesn't come crashing down on top of you. And they remove the overburden, and this high wall that's created is very susceptible to erosion. Mountaintop removal, this is just cutting the top of a mountain off and dumping all that material, all the leftover spoils is what they're called, which does not contain the mineral, is just moved and dumped somewhere else. So that you can see they've removed the entire top of a mountain in that one. Here's where they call this subsurface. This is the taking of minerals from underneath the ground, usually by digging in sideways in the side of a mountain or something like that. This is underground. You see they left a shaft here and a shaft here just to make sure that the rest of the mountain doesn't fall down on their heads. And they call it a room and pillar, this being the pillar that holds the roof on. And then they use dynamite and heavy machinery to remove from the inside of the earth. And they use tunnels and things like that to get it out to the surface. So another shot of the room and pillar method, cutaway here. And you can see that when this was mined, they left a bunch of these columns in place. And what's not shown is the sort of the ceiling inside there that those columns would be holding up. And this is done in flat or gently dipping bedded ores, so they leave the pillars in place in a regular pattern as they remove the ore or whatever mineral they're taking out of there. And then when they're done, they'll start by removing the pillars, starting from the back of the mine and working their way out. And this is done not just to increase the amount of stuff they can take, but also for safety. This way the mine will never unintentionally collapse if you intentionally collapse it yourself. The Longwall, you can see this is a photograph, and if you can see the people in here looking pretty old, this is dated 1916, so nearly 100 years ago. They dug a narrow tunnel. It's supported by these removable pillars. Here they're using pieces of lumber, tree trunks or what have you. And when they're done, they actually will remove the pillars and allow it to collapse. So extraction, if you talk about subsurface versus surface mining, subsurface mining has less of an impact on the environment, but it's also more dangerous to the workers due to things such as collapses, but also any kind of gas or dust that's a product of the mining. The miners that work there are sort of trapped breathing that stuff for their entire working shift. And black lung is associated with coal miners, and because they're underground in a coal mine and they're breaking the coal out, and it generates a lot of dust, and once that gets into the lungs, it really doesn't work. It's not really possible as of right now to get the coal dust out of you. And a note about that, if somebody quits smoking, their lungs will start to get better as soon as they've stopped smoking, but black lung is permanent. So after mining, some of these steps even if the mining, ignoring the environmental impact of the mining for a moment and just looking what happens after you mine it. So The mining, exploration, and extraction does have effects. It disturbs lands. You have accidents and all sorts of impacts on the workers that do it, as well as the local environment. But then the ore is taken somewhere for processing. It may be on the site, it may be nearby, but there's an environmental impact of all the transportation of moving huge quantities of ore and dirt, and then the impacts you have from the transportation is burning of fossil fuels and things like that. But also some of the other concerns here: solid waste, it creates radioactive material, air, water, and soil pollution, the noise, the safety and health hazards, and so on. And then finally, you get using the ore now that it's been processed and turned into maybe a metal if that's what you were mining. But again, there's more transportation to get it to the market, and also the associated types of pollution that can go with it. So the global reserves that are not fuel, we're going to treat fuel separately, things like coal and oil. Mostly in the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and what was the Soviet Union. And the former republics include places like the Ukraine and some other areas that are rich in resources. In the United States alone, there are 2 billion tons of ore extracted every year, which means for every man, woman, and child on the planet, that just in the nation rather, that's 10 tons for each person. So per capita, for the person listening to this video right now, you represent 10 tons of ore that has been extracted from the earth. Western Europe really doesn't have too many of these mines that are productive, and they depend on minerals, and they get a lot of them from Africa. And for us in the United States, about half of the things that we need, that, in ignoring the fuel, just taking regular minerals, more than half of them have to be imported because they don't exist in the U.S. at all. U.S., Germany, and Russia consume 3/4 of the most widely used metals, and there are concerns these are not renewable resources. So as they are depleted, companies will start settling for lower quality ores, and extracting them requires more processing. And not only does that cost more money, it generates more pollution, and more energy is now required. So in 1872, the United States passed a general mining law. This encouraged mining in the United States, and you can think about the gold rush in California and Alaska, but there's also silver and lead, copper, uranium, and the hard rock minerals that might be used in construction or something like that. And with this law, the U.S. was encouraging mining to occur, understanding that it was good for the economy for someone to go out and start trying to find these minerals so that things could be made from it. This law gives free access to potential miners for on public lands, and they can make a claim if they make a discovery. So if somebody went into a nationally Bureau of Land Management area, for example, and they found some copper, they can actually claim that copper even though it's on public land. So a person or a corporation can patent that claim, meaning to kind of take ownership of it, but they have to make the declaration that it does have valuable minerals, and they need to spend $500 to improve the land for mineral development. And that could be done just by building a shack, like a tool shed on the property to hold your tools. But by doing that, and you file a claim, then you have the right to pay the U.S. government for the mining rights on that land. The land would still belong to the government, but the minerals found on it would belong to you if you were to make this claim. And due to the fact this law was created in 1872, they set prices, $2 to $5 an acre, which nowadays is laughable. But any kind of move by the U.S. government to increase this fee is going to be opposed by corporations. And although they make up a small minority, they do have a large amount of money to give to politicians to make sure that their concerns are listened to. Continuing on the 1872 General Mining Law, you notice the comment there, you don't even need to ever extract the minerals just to continue to own those rights. So you can, if you were to discover something, you can make that claim and then just sell the mining rights to a company and make millions of dollars. And oftentimes these are foreign companies, and the United States actually gets no royalties from and it could be millions or more dollars. What the value of that what you found in the earth, but the U.S. government gets nothing for that. And later on, if the public land is designated as a valuable wilderness area, the government can buy it back but no, it's not $2 to $5 per acre anymore. Now it's market value, and it could be tens of thousands of dollars per acre now. So if somebody did this where they made a claim, paid the government $2 to $5 an acre, they could turn around and sell it back to the government for a lot more money. So any lands that are mined do not have to be reclaimed, and this is probably the most outrageous part of this law. When it was created, it was a guy with a pickaxe in one hand and his donkey in the other, and they would go out and scratch at the surface of the earth, and that was that. But you saw the pit mines and things like that. If that was on public land, there's nothing obligating that mining company to restore the land to what it was when they got there. They can leave it not just as a big hole in the ground, but if there's any kind of pollution that goes with it, there's very little accountability for the companies for that. So the company, according to this law, which is a very old law at this point, the company would not have to spend any money to fix up the property, and they can actually leave contaminated soil. If there's any water that was contaminated, that's not their problem anymore. It's a problem of the taxpayers. Here's a case study in Colorado. There was a Canadian company that bought a site for a few $1,000s, and they spent $1 million developing this site and removed $98 million worth of gold. And in the process, they had a pretty bad pollution issue where the drainage that was coming off of their operations leached into a river. And even though they made $98 million at this site, when the EPA came to charge them to say, hey, clean up the mess you make, they declared bankruptcy. The money was all gone, and the taxpayer funded EPA Superfund was responsible for cleaning it up. They spend about $40,000 per day presently to contain the waste. And this could also contaminate the irrigation water, groundwater, and there's really no way to clean that up, at least not easily. 1977, there was the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, and this law said that mine lands must be restored to pre-mining condition, so they're seeking to undo some of the damage created by the 1872 law. And there were one of the things is the mining companies were charged a tax so that the government would collect that money and then use it to fix up the land if the company didn't do it. Problem is, this law really doesn't have any success to it because the politicians can be convinced to not go after the companies with a generous contribution to their campaign, I'm sure. So some environmental effects of mining mineral resources. Obviously, it disturbs the land surface, especially the open pit mines and the other surface mining. Subsidence is when the ground starts to actually sink. So if you're taking a huge amount of resources from underground, for example, it could be oil or it could be solid minerals that you're taking out. The ground will actually begin to sink in that area. It's because you're taking out stuff from underneath of it. The erosion of solid mining waste. So mining companies generate a lot of waste and they just create a big pile of it, and then the weather is going to start carrying it into water systems. They use a lot of acid in processing these ores and the resources, so you actually wind up with some acid contamination. Air pollution, not just the vehicles and the amount of fossil fuels burned in the vehicles and performing all these operations, but also if the erosion of the surface, the soil particles could get airborne, then that's an air pollution issue. And then the storage and leaking of liquid mining waste, because they do generate a lot of water-based liquid waste, but it's contaminated, and if it seeps into underground water and stuff like that. So just a little cartoon showing you the different types of mining. And over here, the subsurface mining opening, that would be what you might imagine like the old days, a guy with going in a little cart, pushing it on the rails into the mine, and with a shovel in one hand and a donkey in the other, and going in there. But nowadays things are much more industrialized. But what kind of effect could this have? You get the acid drainage from the reaction of the mineral with water, and it winds up getting into the river, and then the mine has been contributing to river pollution. Inside this mine you can't see, but it's possible that some of the um, contaminants might be percolating down through the soil and into groundwater. So subsurface mining can also contaminate groundwater. Over here you can see the surface mine where literally just huge volumes of earth are carried off and processed somewhere. But now you have exposed soil that can easily just wash down and get erosion into a liquid, into the river or something like that. And a lot of contaminants can wash through the soil into the groundwater beneath, just as in the subsurface mining. So that's enough of the mining. We're going to talk now about fishing and some of the techniques that commercial fishermen use and the environmental impacts of all these things. So there's 3 pictures here showing 3 different techniques they use. The first one is drift netting. That's a transparent nylon net. It's they're pretty long. You can see the boat in the picture here. They'll just set the net out, and then they take some of these nets are extremely long, and then they just drive the boat around to close the net, and then they pull it up into the boat. So they surround that school of fish, and they can get them onto the boat. Long line fishing uses a very long line here with the buoys on it, and it supports this line here with all these hooks coming off of it. And there could be thousands of hooks on this one long line, and they drop it down, and even if only you get one fish on every 100th hook, you're still going to wind up with a lot of fish based on how long this long line is. Trawling, this entails the dragging of a big net through the water, and here you can see there's almost like a bucket shape to the net, and they just drag it across the bottom if they're looking for bottom feeders and pull that net back up onto the boat. So the drift netting, this can entangle large pelagic species, which are things like seabirds, dolphins, whales, sharks, turtles, and rays. And I remember during the 80s, that's where people were starting to really respond to how many dolphins were getting caught in tuna nets, that people were boycotting buying tuna fish in a can, because if a tuna fisherman snared a dolphin in their net, they would not really care if the dolphin lived or died. And if they came up onto their boat, it probably wouldn't survive, and they would just dump it back in the water. So a lot of dolphins died in this kind of technique, but also turtles and occasionally whales or birds. And so during the 80s, 10,000 dolphins and whales and millions of sharks were killed every year. And we only know this by self-reporting by the fishermen, so that number could actually be much higher. So in 1992, the UN created a voluntary ban on using a net longer than 1.5 miles. And it was up to each country to decide if they wanted to enforce their fishermen to do that. But the net itself in the old days could have been as much as 10 kilometers long. And now that's considered too long, but again, it's voluntary if your nation chooses to participate in this ban. But it has made some progress. Long line, that's the one with all the hooks that are hanging off of it. The 2 different things they can do is they can actually have it sink and sit on the ocean floor to get the bottom feeders, or they can have it float from the surface and catch fish that way. These can also be tens of kilometers long with thousands of hooks, and the baited hooks are attached to the long line. And it's time consuming for the fishermen to bait over 1,000 hooks, but that's what they do. And this type of fishing does still endanger sea turtles, pilot whales, and dolphins. So here you have a pelagic long line. Pelagic just means out in the open water. So you're not talking about shallow water, but it doesn't mean that the net has to be at the bottom. It could be floating at the surface. So it's not anchored. The fisher boat will just drop this off with a radio beacon, drop it off in the morning, come back in the evening and pick up the net and see what kind of fish you have. And they use this to catch large tuna and other species. So here's the type that actually sits on the bottom, and this would be used to get some kind of fish that is likely to eat scraps off of the bottom of the ocean. Just another type of long line though. Trawling, this one does have a pretty significant effect on the environment in some places. So one variety, the trawling net is just kind of dragged through the water, but this one is dragged on the bottom, and that can have environmental impacts on the ocean. They're trying to show you a before and after picture here of an area before trawling, and the ground trawling goes through and wipes out whatever was there. In this case, there was a significant coral reef community there, and one drag of a trawling net through it can undo what took 1,000 years for that reef to grow. So some facts on fishing. Oceans provide 1% of all human food, but make up 1/10 of protein, and 1/3 of all the harvest is in China. But 1/3 of the harvest is also used for purpose other than food. They make, fish oil, fish meal, animal feed. 1/3 is bycatch. Bycatch is what we're saying with the dolphins and sharks and things like that get caught up in that fishing technique, but they're dumped right back into the water, and oftentimes they're dead from this. They get killed in the process. So the bycatch is just thrown back overboard and has no commercial value. Oceans only contain 1/10 of the large body animals that they once held, such as whales and the big sharks. This is mainly the impact of man overfishing or using techniques that snare a lot of the bycatch in the process. So, that's pretty, it's a sad statistic to see that only 1/10 of the large-bodied animals, such as marine mammals, are there anymore. Just a few words about aquaculture. This is when you, what they might call a fish farm, and it's called that because it's in an enclosed area. It might actually be set up somewhere in a saltwater ecosystem, but they use nets or fences to kind of trap the water in there. So it's 5% of the total food production worldwide is through aquaculture. One of the biggest things is seaweed, which is not too popular in the United States, but especially in parts of Asia, a lot of seaweed is consumed. You see some shellfish here, like mussels and oysters, and that's a pretty big part of aquaculture. Shrimp and some fish. So 90% of mollusks, that's the clam family, are actually that when you go to a restaurant or the supermarket and buy anything like oysters or clams, 80% come from fish farms, like through aquaculture. 40% of all of the shrimp and 75% of kelp, which is the seaweed. The thing about eating fish is that cold-blooded fish are more efficient in producing protein. So it means for every 1 million calories of feed, trout is raised on these fish farms through aquaculture. So for 1 million calories of food, the trout can make 35 grams of meat, of protein. And this is more efficient than, say, chicken, certainly more than cows. But even chickens are pretty efficient. But the trout is more efficient because chickens are warm-blooded, and a lot of the energy goes to keeping that body warm, and trout and salmon don't have these issues. Industrial aquaculture can threaten natural coasts. The farmed salmon was found to be the largest contributor of PCBs from protein in humans, and it comes from what the fish are fed, but PCBs is a top. We know that it's a carcinogen, something that causes cancer, and if it's present in humans, there's a good chance that it's coming from salmon, which was raised on a fish farm. And wild salmon would tend to be healthier because it has a lower fat content. So a couple of laws that are related to fishing, and one is the UN Law of the Seas. When a boat goes out into the Atlantic Ocean, they might sometimes make another nation angry. Spain is known for sending their ships all over the Atlantic Ocean, even as far as off the coast of Canada to go fishing. And issues would start to arise, and nations would start to, get a little mad at each other. If you saw a boat from Canada sitting off a sandy hook and it's fishing, so the UN decided to say that all countries have what they call an exclusive economic zone that's 200 miles from the edge of land. So they're saying not only does the United States have all the land, it's also 200 miles out into the ocean so a Spanish ship cannot come to fish in that area without permission from the U.S. government. Seafloor, nations have up to 12 miles, and that's just talking about the seafloor, not the exactly saying the exclusive economic zone, but nations really kind of own up to 12 miles off the beach there. And they do allow for transferable quotas, which can be sold to others. When they do that, if you're finding that you're not taking as much fish from an area as you could actually sell that to another nation. The Magnuson Act established 200-mile fishing area. It set up regional councils. So when you hear that a flounder has to be 18 inches long or you have to throw it back, in the United States there's regional councils that look at how fish are doing. So something like a striped bass has to be 34 inches in order for you to keep it when you catch it one year, and next year it might be 36 if they decide that they're being overfished. So the Magnuson Act set up the regional councils that do that. And the Magnuson Act also protects habitat, try to minimize bycatch so that dolphins and other types of animals don't die in fishing nets, and also rebuilds overfished stocks. We'll talk now just for a few minutes about global economics. Globalization, this is the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. It's basically as technology increases, we're starting to learn more about other cultures and things like that. And globalization is just sort of this idea about different parts of the world, interacting with one another and also experiencing each other's cultures. So really, it's just saying that the world is getting smaller in how well we know other cultures now. And an important fact here is that the economy and the environment are linked. And the wealthiest countries on the planet make up 15% of the population. And the people in these nations have an income which is 20 times that of people in poor nations. So the richest 15% of the countries, the people that live there will make 20 times more than a person in a poor country. And if the people in poor nations made just 1/3 the income of the wealthy, Earth's production and consumption would double, which it's good for the standard of living for the people in the poor countries, but then it would be very bad for what Earth would look like if the people from the other 85% were consuming at a rate that, say, we are in the United States. So increases, the note at the bottom is that poorer nations are starting to increase their standard of living, and this is causing a strain on Earth's carrying capacity. So the World Bank, this was created post-World War II in Europe, and it was to assist in reconstruction. The World War II was devastating to the European nations, and after the war, the war was over, but all the nations were broke. So this World Bank was created to help out those nations with figuring out how to pay for fixing up the country again. Now what the World Bank focuses on is making loans to developing nations, and the goal is to reduce poverty by providing capital so that projects can get going. You can maybe start developing some businesses. Healthcare and education are there. Infrastructure is always a big thing. To connect areas by roads or to run high-speed internet cables through a community can have a beneficial impact on that nation. And it also provides money for green projects such as agriculture, water sanitation, reducing greenhouse gases, and things like that. So the World Bank is also going to provide money. So poor nations are usually less concerned about the economy. They're more concerned about their economy than they are about doing things in a way that's safe for the environment. So there's 184 member countries to the World Bank. The nation has to also be a member of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So they are linked. The largest shareholders are there. You see France, Germany, Japan, UK, and the United States. About 5 of the most wealthiest nations on the planet, and those are the largest shareholders. The bank has identified corruption as among the greatest obstacles to development in these poor countries, and it always seems that the poorer the people are, the more corrupt their politicians are. So again, it was formed in response to post-World War II reconstruction and to discuss the future of international economic cooperation. We're going to change gears here and talk about what is referred to as the tragedy of the commons. And you can see a picture of a cow eating the grass there. It's out at pasture, and sort of the question is, who owns that grass there? In a lot of parts of the world, it's not as though somebody owns a lot of property, and a lot of people, even in the United States, their cows or other animals are grazing on land that does not belong to them. It might belong to the government or someone else. So the tragedy of the commons, Garrett Hardin is the name of the fellow who was credited with it. He was an ecologist, a microbiologist, an American. Created a lot of controversy with some of his views. His big concern was overpopulation, and that remains our biggest concern with the environment right now is overpopulation. And he was talking about this a long time ago. He did promote abortion and things, other forms of birth control. And so the abortion issue still remains a very touchy subject for a lot of people. But his concern with overpopulation, he said we should be promoting abortion. He was in favor of population control by the government, and he was in favor of assisted suicide, people at the end of their life, helping them die. And he was against immigration and international aid, trying to, say that the population of people moving into an area would also harm the environment and the economy. So he wrote an article called "The Tragedy of the Commons," and it was published in Science Magazine, 1968. That's a very reputable scientific journal there. The commons means these are land that are common to all people for grazing of your animals, gathering wood, and so on. So if you see this picture with these sheep kind of moseying around, and the idea is if somebody's letting if their animals are allowed to eat on a certain piece of land that does not belong to them, maybe the government is saying it's okay for you to use this land so your animals can eat, but the land is shared by several farmers. A farmer that might have had, say, 10 sheep, they're going to look at this and say, well, I have 10 sheep, but this other guy has 20 sheep, so his animals are eating twice as much as mine, and I better get more sheep to consume more of these resources. And so, because the land is shared, people are less likely to concern themselves with overgrazing and stuff like that. So, if you had a village that had everybody had their own piece of property, people would be less likely to buy more animals because they're concerned about overgrazing their own land. But if we made all that land available to everybody, so it's so-called government owned, then people are going to be less likely to be concerned about overgrazing. They're more worried about not getting their fair share. So the words here saying every farmer will tend to maximize their own profits by increasing their herd or increasing their gathering of resources without regard to the long-term depletion of the land. This is if farmers are using common land. This is rational because the benefit to the individual farmer of, for example, grazing one more animal in the commons is larger than that farmer's share of the overall depletion of the shared resource, which is the commons. So this is an idea, just saying that human nature is just more likely that you're going to increase what you take from the earth when if that resource is being shared amongst other people. And this is applied to today, and the new commons, as it's called. It's pretty much a metaphor for anything held in common, used by all freely and not regulated. So everyone will maximize their own benefit to the detriment of the whole. And modern commons would be overpopulation, a lot more people, a lot more consumption. The oceans, people are going to be more likely to overfish. So you're going to say, if you're a Spanish fisherman, you're going to say, well, if we don't get these fish, the Portuguese fishermen will get it. So they'll be more likely to increase what they're taking because they're afraid that somebody's going to take it, someone else is going to take it, and that resource won't be available. Air, land, and rivers, we all think of them as being common to all of us, so you wind up with pollution. Public noise level, you get sound pollution. National parks are overused, and the earth itself, the whole earth could be a victim of the tragedy of the commons. So some problems just can't be solved by science, and so problems with no technical solution. You see the example of the arms race back when the United States and Soviet Union were just trying to build as many nuclear weapons as they could until they had so many they could blow up the other country 20 times over. But science wasn't what was going to fix that problem. It was going to be through politics. So overpopulation and competition for resources is this kind of problem. Science can't make it so overpopulation won't occur. And also the competition for resources, these need to be solved politically, not by science. A review here, Thomas Malthus, he was, talking a few hundred years ago, an Englishman who proposed that he was pointing out that population of Earth was really kind of going pretty slow, but then it took off. And Malthus, he's concerned with the catastrophe that will happen when there's just too many people on the planet for us to feed them all. So he was kind of into the mathematical side of things, and he said that population growth is the mathematics for it is exponential. And we can, with all these more people, we can grow more food, but we can't have an increase in food production that goes exponentially up like the population does. You might be able to double it in a best case scenario, but just saying you can only increase food supply by arithmetic, whereas population growth is exponential. So eventually we will starve unless we decrease population some other way, but that's not a good ending either. So just to look at some environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This was the primary legislation still used today for protecting biodiversity in the United States. The government nor the citizens are allowed to take actions that destroy endangered species or their habitats. So people like to bring this up. Sometimes a developer goes to develop a piece of land, but there might be some kind of frog that lives there, and it's on the endangered species list, and then the developer can't develop that land anymore. And the people like to poo-poo this one because there was out west. There was a case of snowy owls that were living somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and the logging companies wanted to go and cut all these trees down, and environmentalists were able to hold them back a little bit by using this act and saying, hey, there's snowy owls that live there, and you're going to have them go extinct if you cut all their trees down. And this law is basically there to prevent species from going extinct. If there are declining populations of a species, they seek to stabilize it and enable populations to recover. And in 2010, the plans were in place for 90% of the over 1,000 endangered species, and there are 314 threatened species at that time. And they came up with plans for that. So the Endangered Species Act has been successful. Intensive management has saved or stabilized species. 40% of the declining populations have been stabilized, and these successes happen despite problems. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service are kind of responsible for trying to make sure animal species don't go extinct, but they're not funded very well. And there's been political forces trying to weaken it, people that are in favor of developing the economy without concern to the environment. And because of what we previously talked about, DDT, falcons, pelicans, and bald eagles were all endangered at one point because of DDT. And you can see that there's been, with the bald eagle especially, some very dramatic success there. At one point, there was only a few hundred pairs of nesting eagles in the whole country. And when they banned DDT, the number went up, and this statistic's a little bit older. There could be over 10,000 breeding pairs now, but that all started from just a couple hundred. International conservation efforts, the UN Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This is another UN thing, and the UN doesn't always have teeth. They can just really ask countries to comply. But this one in particular protects endangered species by banning international transport of endangered species animals or their body parts. such as cutting the tusk off of elephants, and the elephants are going to be endangered. So ivory trade has been, banned by the UN, and you can't, if you had, for some reason, if you owned elephant ivory and you tried to take it over a border into another country, it would be confiscated and you might be arrested. There's a convention on biological diversity. They're trying to use biodiversity in a sustainable manner and make sure the fair distribution of the benefits of biodiversity. By 2010, 193 nations had signed on to the convention. And who didn't? Just 3 countries. Andorra, the Vatican, and the United States did not go along with that effort. So some important names. One was mentioned earlier, Rachel Carson. She wrote the book Silent Spring, which led to the U.S. ban on DDT. Aldo Leopold, he wrote a book in you can see 1949, and he was one of the names, along with John Muir. These 2 names are 2 people that are really credited with making the nation more concerned about wildlife. John Muir founded the Sierra Club in Yosemite, Sequoia National Park, and he's responsible for a lot of the parks out west receiving park status. And Theodore Roosevelt set aside a lot of land when he was president for wildlife refuges, and he really set the tone for future environmentalism. And that is it for this lecture. You are now ready to take not just the Unit 4 Part D quiz, but make sure you get all of the Unit 4 quizzes done. Good luck on that, and I will see you again.